Hello. Today I'll be talking about the book of Ruth, and this is all part of our series on the Bride of Christ, where we're looking at what is the identity of the church, who are we as church, and we're doing this by going back to the Old Testament and looking at pictures which foreshadow the church as the Bride of Christ, pictures in the Old Testament of what the church is going to be. And today's book is going to be Ruth. I think if you can, it'll be very useful to just pause the video and go and read the book of Ruth. It's only 4 chapters, take you about 10 minutes. It'd be really good to have a quick skim through, just to kind of get a general feel for the book, general feel for the narrative which is told in this story. And so hopefully you've managed to read the book. But anyway, here's a short introduction to the book, and we'll set the scene in a moment as well. And so the book of Ruth is one of my favourite books in the Bible. It's got a great story, and it's not just a great story in and of itself. It has many threads, many kind of streams of important kind of theology and streams to David, streams to Jesus. It's very important as a book, and it's got so many sort of small details which we can easily miss in the text. So it's just a book which is small but a lot. So it's a great book, and it's just very exciting to read. And sort of every time I read it, there's something new that comes out of it to me. So it's something that is easy to gloss over because it is small and it is a bit of a nice, can be a bit of a glib story for some people, but there's a lot to it, a lot of depth to it. And the other problem we have is that the English translation doesn't necessarily convey all the subtleties that is there in the original Hebrew language. And that's not to dismiss our English translations. They're very good, and we can take them for what they are. But there are just these little subtle bits, which just to make it even more exciting, at least for me, it does. So just one example of this is the use of names in the book of Ruth. In the first 4 verses of Ruth, we are introduced to a list of characters. So we've got, it says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. And both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. And so just in these first 5 verses, we've got a list of names which to us are fairly meaningless. But actually, when we get into the meaning of the names, we start to see that these names generally seem to link to the character's role in the story, and they tell you a bit more about their own personal character. And so it just highlights to us like what's going on in the story. And then we also get Boaz later, whose name has a meaning. So just to give you some of the meaning, he's got Elimelech, which means my God is king. Naomi, which literally can mean my delight or pleasantness. Got Mahlon and Chilion, whose names mean sickling and weakling. You got Orpah, which means turning one's neck. And you got Ruth, which can mean refreshment, comfort, satiation, which sort of means to satisfy to the full, kind of like this full satisfaction. And then later in the book, as we say, we've got Boaz, and that literally means strength is within him. Sometimes you might see it meaning like swiftness, fleetness, but the literal translation will be strength is within him. And all these characters, if you've just read through Ruth or if you haven't, basically fit these descriptions. So you've got Mahlon and Chilion, for example, sickling and weakling. They're both, all that their role is in the story is that they die. Orpah, turning one's neck. Orpah leaves Naomi behind when Naomi says to go. So almost like that turning to one neck, almost a judgmental view of Orpah's role in this. The text doesn't give any sort of judgment on what Orpah does, but the turning one's neck, perhaps the name is casting a judgment on what Orpah chose to do. And then Ruth, refreshment, comfort, satiation. We'll see through our discussion today that actually this is Ruth's character. Ruth is someone who brings refreshment, brings comfort, brings this satiation, brings this satisfaction to the full. And we also see that Boaz is a man of strength, not just physical strength, but spiritual strength as well. And so that's just a point of actually being English, we can miss some of these subtleties which are in the book and which make the book even more beautiful than it is already. And they just should hopefully help us kind of get a grip with the story. And so to set the scene of the book, as in like, where is this book based? What is the kind of background to the book, to the story that's going on? And so we're told right at the start that these are the days when the judges ruled and there was a famine in the land. And so this idea that it's when the judges ruled takes us back to the book of Judges, which in our Bible comes the book before this book. And in this book of Judges, we find out that the people did as they pleased because there was no king. The morality of Israel was gradually getting worse through the book of Judges. And so understanding this message in Judges of the sort of depravity of Israel sets up a stark contrast between what was sort of normality of the time in terms of low morals, and then Boaz, who comes in and is somebody who is an upstanding citizen. He is following the law. He is going beyond the law and doing more than he needed to. And so Boaz is a really stark contrast to the book of Judges. And another key setting to note for this book is that we see that Naomi's family and Boaz, who is part of the extended family of Naomi's family, were from Bethlehem, which is in the land of Judah. And at the end of this book, we get a family tree which points to David, which tells us that this family line is also to Jesus, who was also born in Bethlehem. And so this sort of background of Bethlehem helps create, and being part of Judah helps create this image of Boaz being a type of Christ. That is a picture of Christ in the Old Testament. And so when we look to Boaz, we can say, this man, he's part of the line to Jesus. He is also going to be a foreshadow, a picture of Jesus. So we can look at Boaz and learn more about Jesus through his character. And this also helps us understand with the Bride of Christ theme. If Boaz is a type of Christ, then Ruth and the work that Boaz does for Ruth and Naomi must tell us a bit about the church. And so we can learn about the church from Ruth and Naomi through this book, because we can see Boaz as a type of Christ, and we know this through the background to this book due to the setting and locations which are given to us, and then through the wider Old Testament, what these settings mean through like prophetic words. And so this foreshadowing of Boaz as Christ and his being a kinsman redeemer in chapter 4 to both Naomi through the redeeming of her land and to Ruth through marrying her points us to this idea of the church. But this kinsman redeemer idea is something which is sort of alien to us in modern culture, because we don't have the term kinsman redeemer anymore. And in fact, if we read through scriptures, we might not understand it either, because it's not that common in scripture to come across the kinsman redeemer. It comes up in Leviticus chapter 25 specifically, and I think also 27 as part of the law, and it sort of talks about when somebody's in need who's one of your relatives. And occasionally we hear about the term redeemer as a reference to God. And I think that in the book of Ruth is the only time where the kinsman redeemer concept is actually referred to specifically about a person. So this is possibly the only time we really get an understanding of the kinsman redeemer law in action in the scripture. So it is quite hard for us to understand and get our heads around when this is where it is and where we can get our heads around it. So the term kinsman and redeemer from sort of Leviticus and historical understanding of it is that it would be a male relative who had the option of a kind of compassionate responsibility to act on behalf of a relative who was in trouble, danger, or need. So the example here is the male relatives had died, leaving Naomi and Ruth on their own, so they would have been in danger. They would have had land which they couldn't look after. There was little they could do, so they would have been in poor. They would have probably ended up having to go into some sort of slavery, be servant women somewhere. And the option for the male relative was, well, I can purchase your land, I can pay for you, and look after you. So the kinsman redeemer would basically save someone. In Leviticus, the idea is if someone, like a brother, sells themselves into slavery, a kinsman redeemer could pay the price for them to the owner and bring them out of slavery and kind of give them a new life from them, stop them being poor. So it was to help people who are in need. And so that's what the idea of the kinsman redeemer is, somebody who can come to their relatives and pull them out of deepest troubles and save them from that. And so here in the book of Ruth, we've got Naomi and Ruth who were in need of being redeemed. And we see why in chapter 1. We see that they were in need because all the males, Elimelech, Mahlon, and Chilion, had died. And so the first chapter, it continues to show us about the pain of Naomi from this. Naomi, we see, instructs her daughters-in-law to leave her and find themselves new husbands, because in verse 13, her bitterness is too much for them. So these deaths, which had left Naomi in need, had left her bitter and really in pain. And so she was really in need. And so Orpah agrees to the instruction and leaves Naomi, but we're told that Ruth stays and clings to Naomi, and confessing that Naomi's God will be her God and that she will be with her and support her through all of this for all time. And so we get, the story continues, and the two return to Bethlehem, and we hear of Naomi's pain again in verses 19 to 22. I'm going to read these verses. I'm going to use my own translation, which is slightly wooden, but hopefully picks out some of the points which may be missed in these verses. But it says, and the two walked until they entered Bethlehem. And as they entered Bethlehem, all of the town went wild concerning them. And they said, is this Naomi? And she said to them, call me not Naomi, which means my delight. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because Shaddai, the Almighty, has made me exceedingly bitter. I went full. The Lord caused me to return empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord testified against me, and Shaddai, the Almighty, has caused evil upon me. And Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, daughter-in-law, with her, returned from the territory of Moab, and they entered Bethlehem in the beginning of the barley harvest. And so Naomi is giving a play on her name. She is a delight, she is pleasant, sweetness, and she's come back and she is now bitter. And she is in pain. She's saying she went full. Fullness was a good thing. It was seen to be like complete, whole. And she's come back empty with nothing. It's also possible that the full meant that maybe she was pregnant when she left and she's come back without her children. She's lost her sons. And so she's gone from a great place to a low place. She is in real pain. And another theme to note in this chapter is there's a lot of repetition of the language of returning and entering. So Orpah was said to have returned to her people. Naomi and Ruth are said to have returned and entered into Bethlehem. And in particular, Naomi had returned to her home, which was a place with the covenant people, the place of God's people, and Ruth had joined her as an outsider, as a Moabite, to the place of the covenant people. And so we've got this emptiness. And it is at this point of returning we see how Naomi had returned. She was bitter and she was empty. She had gone away full. Life was good. She felt blessed, but she had returned with nothing. She had little hope and felt that God had turned on her and abandoned her. This was the pain that she was in. This is why she was in need, why there was going to be a need of a kinsman redeemer, which we see later in the book. And the rest of the book, beyond chapter 1, seems to be talking about this turning emptiness into fullness. There seems to be a key thread throughout the book of Ruth. And it seems to be maybe a key thread for us to learn as the church today, is being taken from emptiness to fullness. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on now for the rest of our study. And so we see in chapter 2, verses 14 and 18, we see the language of being satisfied, which is meaning to be full, to be made full. And not just made full, but made full with abundance, with more left over. Like chapter 2, verse 14. And at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine." So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. And then verse 18, which kind of reiterates that point. And she took it up and went into the city. Her mother-in-law saw that what she had gleaned. She also brought out and gave her the food she had left over after being satisfied. So Ruth was being made full and satisfied, and she had left over, which was then to be given to Naomi. So it wasn't just a satisfaction for one, it was a satisfaction for the both of them. And the idea of being empty also fits sort of like poverty and being poor. Ruth had been gleaning the corn, which was originally from the edge of the field, which would have been a place which was given for foreigners and poor people according to the law. That was to be left for those people, so they could at least have something. But Boaz, which, as if we remember we said earlier, is a Christ-like figure, invites Ruth into glean corn with the others. So the outsider, the foreigner, has been invited in and is allowed to have the abundance of the harvest which was for Israel, and this abundance has been given to the Gentile to join in, which again is a lesson as for the church. As Gentiles, we are invited into the harvest, which happens on Pentecost, and we are filled to the full and pass it on to others, and also back to Israel as well. And so let's continue this theme of fullness. In the story, Naomi tells Ruth about Boaz being the kinsman redeemer, and works out a way for Ruth to approach Boaz and bring up this subject. And there is a lot which can be said and studied about this theme of approaching Boaz and the kinsman redeemer. Chapters 2 and 3, basically, there's a lot which I'm going to skip over here because we want to be quite focused and limited on time. But chapter 3 is a pretty key chapter for understanding Boaz as a Christ type. We'll just say that. And when you see the language of the likes of verse 9 in chapter 3 and the phrase, "spread your wings over your servant," we start to get this imagery of what Christ does, what God does for Christians, spread his wings over, and we get the language of spreading the wings of the mother hen in the Gospels as well. So that's just one of the pictures, but we'll go back to the story and to our main theme. Boaz accepts the opportunity to become the Redeemer, and Ruth is deemed to be a valiant woman, which is a very important phrase, and it's worth, if you want to understand that phrase, it's worth reading Proverbs 31 to kind of understand what that means and kind of understand more about Ruth's character and who Ruth is, because that phrase, valiant woman, is only used here in Ruth and in Proverbs 31. And so there's clearly a link between the two, and so we can learn more about that and more about the church from that. But again, that's not our focus for today. And so we move into verse 17 of chapter 3, and we get this idea of emptiness again. It says, saying, "These 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law." And so, we're getting this idea of emptiness, and Boaz sending Ruth with the barley because he couldn't send them back empty. This was after Ruth had spent the night there, and they had discussed this possibility of them being redeemed. She could not go back to Naomi empty, who in chapter 1 had openly declared about her emptiness. And so the Redeemer is unwilling to let them be empty, wanting to give them fullness, build them up. And so we got this idea. Naomi in chapter 1 returned empty. Ruth had been filled and satisfied in chapter 2 with leftover for Naomi. And now in chapter 3, she is not to return to Naomi empty. There is a pattern here, a pattern of the emptiness being fulfilled, of Boaz being the provider of fulfilling. And as Boaz is a type of Christ, we get this imagery of Christ being the one who satisfies and fills. We may even think of stories in the Gospels which parallel this thing. For example, the feeding of the 5,000. The crowds had been satisfied and there was left over. So that's just one example where we can see. So we can see this picture working here in this book and in the New Testament. But actually, it's not until chapter 4 of Ruth that we see this truly played out. In this chapter, we see that how Boaz comes about being the Redeemer and what he is redeeming. Firstly, as a Redeemer, he has bought the property of Elimelech from Naomi and her sons. This is the first act of redemption. And the second act of redemption was to marry Ruth, to continue the line of Mahlon, as was custom in Levirate marriage, which Fred discussed last week. And this was so that Mahlon's family name would not be cut off and continue. And so we're seeing these acts of redemption done by Boaz. And this leads to verses 13 to 17, which read, "So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life, and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. And so we've got this passage here which completes that reversal of being empty to full. Whilst we don't have the language of fullness specifically in this passage, as mentioned earlier, the idea of potentially of the fullness that Naomi left with originally and come back empty is deemed to be sort of pregnancy language. And so she went away full, potentially pregnant, had her sons, and came back empty without her sons. And so Naomi is now made complete. She has a redeemer in that of a grandson, which in these verses refers to him as her son, which gives that idea, that closeness, that completeness, which would have been very understandable in that culture. And this son will restore her life, nourish and sustain her in her old age. So this is quite a turnaround for Naomi. She had lost everything and she was empty. And now by the end, because of the Redeemer, she was full. And so we've got this pregnancy language. And so we've got physically Ruth was made full at the end by being pregnant and giving birth. So Ruth, the Gentile, was made full by the Redeemer. And then we've got Naomi made full through the blessings, through Ruth, made full because of the Redeemer as well. And so for the picture of a church in this, it should be quite clear. We were all once empty. We were all without hope. But it is through returning to our Redeemer, who is Jesus Christ, who has paid the price for us, that we are made full. We are made complete. Our life is restored and we will be sustained as the church by our Redeemer, Jesus, who doesn't just fill us, but he fills us in abundance. And we as the church have that abundance to go and share with others what has made us full, which is our Redeemer. And so a couple of questions for us to think about this week are, firstly, have we had times of emptiness which have been filled by our Redeemer? What are our stories? What are our testimonies? What are our stories of the fullness of God that comes to us through our Redeemer, Jesus? In our times of need, are we prepared to return to God's promises so that we may be filled and satisfied to abundance by our Redeemer? So are we prepared to return to God's promises, to be kind of filled up again, to be made full when we are in need? Are there times where we are actually like Orpah? Do we relate to Orpah in this story? Times are hard, times are empty. And so actually we need to go our own way, find our own husbands, rather than returning as the church to the bridegroom, which is Jesus, so the bride of Christ, the church, and then Jesus. Do we return to our Redeemer, to where we should be through God's promises, or do we leave like Orpah to find our own way? And what do you think it means for us as a church to have Jesus as our Redeemer in the context of emptiness to fullness? So, what does it mean for us as a church? Amen.